was a history major in college. And I loved history and still do. In fact, most of the things I read are history. But there was a wonderful, wonderful teacher who taught creative writing at this school there. And he was a little dubious about my entering it because I hadn't taken much English before, you know. But I had read, you know, I was a prodigious reader, read everything. So I convinced him that maybe I should be allowed into the class. And it was a wonderful class. He was an absolutely marvelous, marvelous teacher. And then he had an advanced creative writing class, which was by invitation only. You had to write something at the end of the first class, which would be the way he would judge his invitation, whether he should be invited for the advanced class. And I wrote a short story for it. And I was one of three invited. And from that point, I couldn't write enough, you know. They had a college literary magazine. I became the editor of that. And that led to the writing of more short stories, much poetry, and finally the novels. The novel writing was interrupted by 3 years in the Army, World War II, but then resumed as if they got out of the Army. I had 2 books published. And that's how I came to California. One of them was purchased by a young motion picture group, again, the first independent producing group in motion pictures, because until that time, the studios had control of all production, the various studios, and had contracts, you know, term players, term actors, term writers. And a young group, an actor named Burt Lancaster and his manager, Harold Hecht, formed something called Hecht Lancaster Pictures. And at that time, this is right after World War II, Hollywood was populated with a number of people who had fled Nazi Germany. Some of the great, you know, directors of the Germany, Ernst Lubitsch, and people like writers like Billy Wilder, and so many of them. And they did, you know, wonderful things like The Great Walls, much more sophisticated than American musicals up to that time. But it wasn't essentially American work, you know, it was Middle European work. And Burt Lancaster especially had the idea of, why don't we go back to doing American work, to announce their program with a great deal of publicity and hopefully attention-gathering news. They said that they would going to sponsor the work of American writers and do American films in the sense that they deal with American material as opposed to Middle European material, though they did nothing against that, but they felt there should be a balance. And to start the program, they were buying 2 books. One was The Naked and Dead by an unknown writer named Norman Mailer, and the other was my first novel, Burial of the Fruit, by another unknown writer named David Dortort. And the big mistake they made, it was a good idea, the big mistake they made was to bring both of us, bring Mailer out of New York, and I was already here, you know, to write the scripts of our respective novels. Neither one of us had the first inkling of what a script was like or how it should be written. And so we had adjoining offices, was Warner Brothers, and we both wrote what we thought were screenplays of our books. And we spent a number of months at it, handed them in, and in each case, his secretary and my secretary were very flattering and very accommodating because they loved the quality of the writing. You know, the writing was really fine writing. And then the verdict came down that these were very possibly the 2 worst scripts in the history of Hollywood. So Norman, you know, who's always a bit feisty and accosted me and said, how dare they, these mongoloids, these idiots who don't know how to read anyway, you know. It went on and on and on. David, you and I go back to New York. Let's go back to writing books. And I said, I can't do that for 2 reasons. He said, well, what are the reasons? I'm married. Now I have 2 children. My son was just born a few months before that. There's no way I can go back to New York and try to start a new book and take all that time and hope to sell it and everything. Oh, he said, what, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. He says, you're a fine writer. He says, your book got great reviews. But typical Norman, not as good as mine, but, good. So he said, you have no problem, What's your second reason? I said, the second reason is, did it ever occur to you, Norman, that maybe they were right, that these were horrible, awful scripts? And that's when he turned on me and he started jabbing me. He talks, he jabs, And he jabbed me. He said, no. He said, you can't say that. He says, forget all this, He says, I said, listen to him. You go back to New York and do your thing, and I'll stay in Hollywood and write scripts, or try to write scripts, and learn how to write scripts if it kills me. And the truth is, it almost did. One of my first important credits was a film called The Lusty Men, which was about the rodeo. And I told you before that I was a great student of American history. And the rodeo really grew up as a working man's game, sort of. It wasn't a sport. But at that time, men who worked on ranches, there was no organization, no unions, no pension systems, nothing to protect them. So if they were subject to injury, or if at, let's say, 3 o'clock in the morning, they weren't able to get up and ride 12 hours, their bones creaked or ached, they were fired. They became alcoholics. And, to pick up extra money, that's how the rodeo began. They would start this sport of doing all the things they did as a working day job. Bronc riding, you have to bust the wild horses, you have to break the horses. Roping, calf roping, bull riding, all these things. These were matters that had to be done. So actually it was excellence of work. It was sort of a work ethic, and that way they could pick up additional money to help them if they want to get married. How do you get married on this kind of money? How do you raise a family?
So where did these ideas come from? When you started writing The Lusty Men and these kind of things, where did the ideas come from for those?
Well, this was basically a narrative idea. And so, I was hired by a producer named Jerry Wall to do that. And I insisted that I needed to know a little bit more about it. And under his auspices, I joined something called the RCA, the Rodeo Cowboys of America, which is an organized circuit where the cowboys compete for what they call day money, and on the basis of different towns, all the way starting in the Southwest, all the way up to the finals of Madison Square Garden in New York, they compete for day money, and the highest totals become the champion in each category: broncs, bulls, calving, and all that kind of thing. I came across a very startling and wonderful conclusion, because I stayed with the guys who did the work, the writers. But the shows were always preceded by someone like Gene Autry in a white, elaborate, embroidered, cowboy suit, or Roy Rogers, and they would ride around the arena, and sometimes they would sing, and play what they call the guitar, and took all the money. And what was left, the guys who did the work, it was like being in the trenches, because they knew that these bulls and these horses, these broncs, were crazy. And the facts were that almost every man who did this on a more or less steady basis had broken bones, including almost every bone in his body broken at one time or other, every single bone, or didn't live to survive, So I felt this is the story that has never been told. So I wrote the story, and originally I called it Cowpoke, but they felt that was too obscure. So we changed it to Lusty Men. And it was very successful. Bob Mitchum played the part. He had been what they called a rodeo bum, as they called him. Early in life, he said, my God, this is the story of my early years, he said. And yet I gave it, a love angle, because with Susan Hayward and a wonderful actor, Arthur O'Connell, who was Susan's husband, who managed the rodeo, the circuit, who was attracted to Mitchum, and Mitchum attracted to her. So it was a very powerful story. A wonderful director, Nick Ray, directed it. And that established me as a Western writer. But then I went to see the movie, and a number of other movies I wrote after that, and I would squirm there, And even though they were doing well, they did very well. It was, if I forgive me for saying it, the power of my writing that did it. They were not screenplays, and I would sit there in acute discomfort. So what to do? Then I remember I said earlier that television came up, and even though I wrote a number of feature films, I couldn't get over the feeling that, and I wasn't comfortable doing it, that something was missing, something very important, very crucial was missing. And so television came up, and here I was, a top screenwriter earning some pretty good dollars. And in television at that time, they paid $700. That's what you got for a script. And so I decided I would go that route, only because I needed the practice of writing. Maybe I would learn something. And so I wrote a number of things, many shows, good, bad, who knows, but I did. But I was probably picking up some knowledge. How much, I don't know. Until I came into the orbit of a man named Frank Wisbar, who was one of these German refugees who had been a prominent director at UFA Films in Berlin before the war. And he had a show called the Fireside Theater, which was the only dramatic show on American television, the first dramatic show. And Wisbar loved my writing, but he was such a smart man. He was such a shrewd man. He said, "You are not a screenwriter," but he says, "You write so beautifully, but you're not a screenwriter." Anyway, I wrote a number of scripts for him. And then I decided he was right. And maybe Norman Mailer was right, too. I should go back to New York. So in 1953, I packed the wife and the 2 kids in the car, and we went back to New York. We had an apartment in Los Angeles, and for some reason, we held on to that because everyone told us it's so crowded. The post-war boom had just begun, and there wasn't housing. And where do you think you'll find a place to live? So my wife said, let's hold on to this. Just a small apartment. And we did. And we traveled to New York, and I did some live TV there. But one show that I did get to do there, among a lot of other shows, was a show called Suspense. And Marty Manulis produced it. They did, fictional scripts. And I said to them, because my first novel, Burial of the Fruit, was about the gangster era in New York City. And how does a young man become a gun-toting criminal? He wasn't born with a gun in his hand. What are the socio-economic forces that put a gun, in effect, into his hand, and the reasons why, that lead to his untimely death? John Ruskin, the famous English essayist, and I used to read all the famous English poets and essayists, in one of his anti-war essays, had the phrase, an anti-war phrase, the burial of the fruit, meaning the young go first in war, and the fruit, the best of humankind, the young people who are the future of humankind, are destroyed in war. And that phrase stuck in my mind as a fitting title for the book. So I knew something about the gangster element in New York. I said, why don't we do the story about, why don't we do a real story instead of all this fantasy? Like what? I said, why don't we do a story about a gangster named Dutch Schultz, born Arthur Flegenheimer, became Dutch Schultz, and became the towering figure in the gangster world of the entire New York region. And they said, wow. So I wrote it, and whether Arthur Penn or Bob, somebody directed it, but it was a great show. However, the thing I wanted to make, the point, which taught me something about actors, I was asked to be present when in the casting process. It was a lot different than out here. Writers were held in more respect at that time in New York. And the New York acting group would send in different people, casting, talent agents. And both Arthur Penn and Bob and Marty would look at me, and I'd shake my head. And then in walks a big lumbering guy, because Schultz was that kind of a hulking figure, And, with the talks out of the side of his mouth. I said, that's Schultz. And it's a guy, an actor named Rod Steiger. First part. And he won the Peabody Award for Best Actor of the Year for that. And became a pretty good friend.
So when you...
So
go
that
ahead.
established in my mind that you don't need a famous actor if you write a strong enough part, which later I put to work in
Bonanza.
Yeah. New York was so horrible then. I had 2 small children, and we couldn't have a fine place to live. We had to rent rooms by the night in cheap hotels. It was just awful. My wife said, let's go back to California. So we drive back to California, and the last day, I drive from Albuquerque back to Los Angeles, about 800 miles. And we get into our apartment around 9 o'clock at night, and I'm absolutely exhausted. And it was the second floor. I'm climbing the stairs. We hear the phone ringing. We forgot to disconnect the phone. This is the whole turning point, really. And race up the stairs, and it's Wizbar on the phone. Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you. I said, Frank, wow. What's the problem? He says, I want you in the studio in 20 minutes. I said, Frank, I just drove in from Albuquerque. It's 800. I'm dog tired. I'm filthy. I want to take a shower. He says, tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock, I'm counting. So, oh no, I went in the studio. So I tell him, she said, you better go and see him. So I drive to the studio, and there he has a script there, and he hurls it across at me. He said, I have to shoot this in the morning. I'm holding it. So what do you want me to do with it? He said, I want you to rewrite it. Now even, until that time, I had never produced anything. This is before everything, right? And I wrote my own scripts. I had never rewritten a script. I didn't understand the importance of the rewrite, the screenwriter's contribution. And so he says, I want you 7 o'clock in the morning, I start shooting at 8 o'clock. So all right. So I take the script home, I start to read it, and it's someone else's work. I am not subjective about it. I'm not trying to protect my precious words. It's someone else's work. And that's what the whole screenwriting
Was it harder or easier that it was someone else's work?
Easier. Oh, I said, here's where it goes wrong. Here's where it makes a terrible right turn, or left turn, we should make a right turn, whatever, So I sit down and I start rewriting the script from page word 1. And I finish about 3 o'clock in the morning. Remember, it's only a half-hour script, and I was very fast. Take a shower, sleep for 2 hours, and then go and see him. And he's sitting there waiting for me. He's already there. And he grabs the script out of my hand, and he starts reading it. And he reads it, nothing changes his face. Finally finishes, he looks up at me. He says, Wunderbar, at last you are a screenwriter. See, it was someone else's work. I lectured about that later on, the difference between narrative writing and dramatic writing, which is basically subjective writing and objective writing. It's such a simple difference, and yet it's, but I say, you almost die trying, because that's why so many novelists come out to Hollywood and they cannot write successful screenplays, because the narrative method is diametrically opposed to the dramatic method. See, in the narrative method, some of the best writing is description or introspection. The thoughts went through his mind as he looked upon it, whatever, or that kind of thing. Or the beauty of the landscape. Many writers, have that great skill of embroidering something. You read some of William Faulkner's when he talked about Yakima County, and the beauty, or the analysis of the decaying, degenerate, New South, as opposed to the glories of the Old South. How do you put that into the words of an actor? You have to put it into dialogue. It's the only tool you have. So the use of dialogue and economy and brevity in moving the story forward are probably the most important things in screenplay writing. And being aware of that, the importance of that all-important second act curtain. Because without a third act, you don't have a play. And whether it's a play for the stage or the large screen or the small screen, it's all a play. It's all the dramatic method. As Aristotle said in one of his famous essays, talking about the theater, it's 3 walls and an audience. When you write a subjective piece of work, whether it's a novel or a short story or a poem, you only have to please one person, that is the editor or whoever's going to publish it. Hopefully the audience will reciprocate and also follow the editor's instinct. When you're writing a play, the narrative method, there's that 4th wall, the audience, they have to respond to. So you have to, it's like the North Pole and the South Pole. You have to transform yourself from a subjective person, which most people are, remain all their lives, into an objective person. Playwrights are not born, they're made. And what I mean by that is they have to overcome the subjectivity that all of us are born with. And they have to achieve objectivity. Another word for that is maturity. I was the first writer to become a television producer, and that followed 3 years as president of the television branch of the Writers Guild of America West. And that began with a show I created called that I produced called The Restless Gun, with an actor named John Payne, for whom I had written a pilot script. They'd had trouble with the script, and a number of people had worked on it. And then they asked me to rewrite it, and I was doing a tremendous amount of work in TV, working on a number of scripts almost at the same time, getting the feel of it, even though I had written some fairly important motion pictures before then. But I felt television was a coming, and a very important coming event, and to learn the pace, the economy, the ability to tell a story with brevity and yet keep the essence of it. I wish I could do that when I speak, but writing. And so I rewrote it, and I was able to shoot it immediately, and John Payne never forgot that. He called me to have lunch with him and told me that he was doing a show called The Restless Gun at MCA, which was then had a production outfit called Review Productions. This is very early in the game. This is like now. This is like 2 years later. So it's about 1957. And I thought that he wanted me to write an episode of I said, and I had all these big shows, you know. And I said, John, I'm not, you know, thanks a lot, but I'm not. I don't want to write another half-hour script, half-hour western. He said, I'm not calling you about that. He said, come and have lunch with me because I want you to produce the show for me. So that was kind of interesting. That was sort of exciting. And I said to him, well, John, you know, what makes you think that I know that I'll be able to produce a show? I've never produced anything. And he said to me, he feels, because he was a very intelligent man, that television, because of the lack of time and budget, there's only so much time and there are only so many dollars, you know, that someone who knows script will almost be necessary for that ability to produce a show on time, on budget. So we agreed. I had a handshake agreement, and then he asked me to come to the studio and meet the executives at MCA, who were my agents. You know, I knew a great many of them, including Lou Wasserman and people like that. I come to the studio, and he tells them he wants me to produce The Restless Gun. And they look at him as though he's insane, totally out of his mind, and proceed to tell him why I will be a total fiasco as the producer of the show. You know, what does a writer know about budget? What does a writer know about the discipline of coming in on time? And they went on and on until I got up and said, well, gentlemen, thanks for doing such a great job representing me. Thanks a lot. And I walked out. And before I could shut the door, John Payne came running after me. And he said, where are you going? I said, well, you just heard what they said. I mean, these are, you know, Wasserman and all these other people. So thanks so much, but I'll be leaving. He said, no, 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 no. He said, I want you to produce the show. I said, in spite of that? He said, in spite of that. So I said, wow, John, that's very fascinating. He said, please do it. I said, I'll do it on the basis that it's a handshake agreement. If I don't cut the mustard, if you don't feel I can't produce the show the way it should be done, let's say in 6 or 8 weeks, just tell me. And that's it, no other, and I'll leave. Or if I feel that I'm not doing a job or I'm not comfortable with it, I'll leave. And so we just did a handshake thing. And I had been nominated to run for president of the TV branch for the 4th time, but I had to withdraw because now I was in a position of hiring and writers. It was a 5-day program. They would rehearse the first day, they would shoot for 3 days, and then they would lay off the 5th day. So that was 5 days, but you have to carry crew and personnel and everything the entire period. They're on layoff only in terms of not functioning, but they must be paid anyway. And that's the way it was going along, and MCA was watching every dollar theoretically. And my first greeting at the lot when I came in, first day, I was summoned to the office of a man named Carl Hickey, who was the famous production manager of Review Productions. And he was a tough, tough guy, really a bully. And he said, I just want you to know what I think of you. He says, you're a writer, right? And you're not fit to be a producer. And he went on this way with all his, his clique of people around him, doing the same thing that the MCA officials had done. So I was running this gauntlet of all these people who thought a writer doesn't belong, in this kind of a situation. And I was beginning to have doubts about myself too. So I said, well, thanks for all the kind words, but I'm going to try to do the best I can, and left. And after about a month of this, here I'm, either writing or going every line of the script before we go to production. And I had all this experience writing television scripts. I must have written, 40, 50 scripts before this few years. And I could see where they were saying, there was too much dialogue, there was excess dialogue, or was verging off the storyline, or going in all sorts of directions at the same time. But there wasn't that great sense of dramatic logic that was moving the story forward. And so I conceived of a plan. I said, look, instead of these 5 days, why don't we start shooting at 8 o'clock on Monday morning? No rehearsal, because, as you know, on the set, actors wait around. So we can use the wait around periods to do any rehearsal that's necessary. And finish the first show at 12 o'clock on Wednesday, 12 noon. Start show number 2 on 1 o'clock Wednesday, and finish that at 5 o'clock Friday night. They said, well, it's crazy. It can't be done? So I said, let's try it. And of course, Payne, who again had that acute business sense, or in the vernacular, who knew how to squeeze a buck. And there's a great closing line to that when I get to it. He loved the idea, and we tried it. And not only did it work, but it became a natural way to do it. And the actors loved it because there was, they weren't waiting. Everybody loved it. But the best thing is, Procter & Gamble was paying $39,000 for a half hour. And they were coming in around $50,000, on the 5-day thing. And now all of a sudden I'm doing The Restless Gun. I'm a writer who knows nothing about budget. I'm doing The Restless Gun, and we bring it in like for $28,000, $27,000. MCA can't believe this. It never happened before in the history. Wasserman comes to me and says, I don't know how you do it, but keep on going. And so we did it. And in the very first year, we took this little show with an actor who was really basically a man who passed the prime of his career. But I populated it with good writers, and good directors, and good actors, you see, as opposed to the usual way these shows have been shot before, which was a production department executive was in charge of it, you know, and story was the least important thing. And so we did it and this way, and we were like, in the ratings, the national ratings, we came in like number 3, number 2. Nobody could believe it, you know. And especially MCA. But what started to happen was that at the end of the first season, Payne was invited to come into New York to meet the top officials on NBC. This was an NBC. And he made a demand. You know, he didn't like the accounting that he had received. And they said, oh, well, you know. So the second year, he came back with delusions of being a star again. And there would be these offers for county fairs, rodeos, weekend things, where he'd pick up anywhere from $25,000 to $50,000 just for a weekend appearance. So naturally, with his sense of dollars, he could resist that. And here I would be short of my lead character. We're shooting 2 shows a week. And I don't have my star back until Monday, or sometimes not until Tuesday, or he leaves sometimes on Thursday. So I began to think the problems of doing a show around one man, you know, that began not as a real thought, but began to build in my mind, you know, out of exasperation, everything else. It also gave me an opportunity to bring in some other wonderful actors. You see, in the pilot of the show, I had a young actor named Michael Landon. And during the course of the show, I brought in somebody who came in for an extras part named Dan Blocker. And I worked with them very carefully. And Dan Blocker especially, I sort of gave him more and more to do. And as much as I gave him to do, he handled everything absolutely perfectly. So when Payne came back, not only did he remind them about the fact that he didn't like their accounting system, but he never stopped, you know, he even went public with it. There were articles in Variety, the Hollywood Reporter, where he actually accused him of stealing, which may have been true, perhaps, but they didn't like to read about it. So while all this is going on, and they're fighting, you know, it's really Carl Hickey, by the way, became, once I showed him how we do two in a week, 2 shows in a week, became my biggest supporter. He became my best friend. He would find books on Western folklore, Western history that I had a fairly extensive collection myself that I wasn't aware of. And so they said to me, well, look, forget, you know, you just do your show, you know, don't let this bother you. And but it became more and more bitter, and Payne kept absenting himself more and more often. And then the idea of not limiting myself to one actor became stronger and stronger. So at the end of the second year, Wasserman came to me and said, look, we're going to buy him out. And they actually bought him out for $1 million in cash, which was a lot of money way back in 1957. And Wasserman comes to me and said, in fact, you know, we're buying him out, getting rid of him, but we want you to stay with us, David. You're part of the family. See, now I'm part of the family. And I said, well, and just without even thinking about it, I said, well, if I'm part of the family, I should be treated as part of the family. What about a piece of the show? Oh, no, we never give it. I said, well, you gave it to an actor. You gave Payne 50% of the show. Oh, but he's a star. I said, well, all right. But one day you're going to have to pay writers, you know, a commensurate salary and a percentage of the profits, because they keep the show going as the producer, the writer-producer. We'll never do it. But we will give you a contract for the rest of your life, as long as you live, with these yearly increases in pay. So I said, well, let me think about it. Now, the show is on NBC. The second year is doing even better than the first year. And NBC comes to me and said, in effect, we want you to do a show for us. What had happened is CBS, which was always sort of the innovator, or it was in those days, Paley was a very progressive kind of executive, Bill Paley. And he had people like Hubble Robinson and Mike Dan working were very good people, as opposed to the, more or less the nonentities at the NBC. And they had pioneered their own in-house show in primetime television, Perry Mason with Raymond Burr. And that was the #1 show at that time. Raymond Burr and Perry Mason was #1 in American television. This was a period where the American male image was deplorable. I don't know if you can remember that, but father was always sort of a bumbling idiot. And the kids made fun of him, and the wife barely could tolerate him. And that was very popular for a while. And I felt, out of respect to my own father, was a wonderful man, a good, decent person, hardworking man, that this was, injurious to the male image of American men. I mean, to the image of American males, and not particularly good for their children to watch. So the idea of perhaps, and because I felt the role of women in the West had never really sufficiently been portrayed, the hardships involved in making the long journey, without doctors, without medicine, without any help at all. What happens when a woman's bearing a child and gives birth to the child? No help, So that part of history had never been portrayed. And so I began to conceive of the idea of to get away from the dependency on the one actor, on a group of actors. And so I said, yes, I'll be very happy to do this for you. I said, but I'm still finishing, I have 12 more shows to finish on Restless Gun. He said, well, can't you write this at night?
In your spare time.
I said, do you have a contract? I said, no, all I have is a handshake with John Payne. So that's what happened. I finished the 12 shows, and I wrote first the treatment, which they loved, and then the script, which they also loved. So in placing Bonanza and the location of it, creating what I call the Ponderosa Ranch, because the great majestic Ponderosa pines, which grow only from 5,000 feet and up, one of the great trees in the world. And I felt, let's call it the Ponderosa, in deference to these great trees. And to give Ben Cartwright, the argument, don't cut unless you plant, don't just destroy your forest, replant it. Which I was called the first conservationist. All these things happened early on, quite a way back. A place where, as opposed to a good king and the good knights of the round table, in this country we don't have a king, but we have a good father and good, sturdy sons, and the relationship between them is one of caring, loving, and understanding. I said, RCA is already manufacturing color sets. And the problem with a color set in the early stages was that it was very expensive. It was $500 or $600. That was a lot of money for a set, especially where there were no color programs on the air. Albert, wonderful. He did some live shows, which in a kind of experimental color, not electronic color. I'll think of it. Which would kinescope to the West Coast, and the kinescopes were horrible. They were awful, So I said, no. I said, why don't we do this show shoot in color? Because how could I go up to Lake Tahoe with this magnificent lake, probably one of the most beautiful alpine lakes in the world, certainly in this country, and the snow-capped peaks and the green of the primeval forests, basically, pristine colors, and shoot in black and white. I said, you already have color. I mean, you're manufacturing color television sets. Why don't we shoot this in color? And they said, we could care less about RCA's inability to sell their color television sets. And not only that, but it costs much more, about 25% more to shoot in color than in black and white. I said, but aren't you all one big happy family? Aren't you part of RCA? Oh, no, no, no. We have our own turf to protect. We only have so many dollars to work with. And you want to shoot it in black and color? I said, yes. Well, forget it. I said, no, I'm not going to forget it. I said, it's crazy. How can I go up there and shoot this black and white? So they said, well, if you're this hot for color, then you pay for what they call the color differential. And you know, what did I know about business? I said, sure, you know. And so from the very first foot, Bonanza was shot in color. As opposed to the image, the one-man image, there were the motion pictures and television, but even primarily motion pictures. You know, let's say the Gary Cooper, the John Wayne image. One man who comes in, meets a problem in a location, because he's a good man and a brave man and capable with guns, he solves the problem, probably through the use of guns, and then at the end of it, you know, having done his good deed, irrespective of the means it took to do that, accomplish that good deed, he rides out of town. I said, but this is, you know, Bernard DeVoto wrote so many wonderful books about the West, including, you know, Mountain Time, which is one of the best. And DeVoto's point is, this is the story not of, this is a myth, the myth of the gunfighter. It's a very inconsequential part of the history of the West. The history of the West, like the history of any other part of the world, is the history of families. And this great migration westward, the greatest migration of people, families, in the history of the world, from the east to the west of America, was a migration of families, children, and, you know, wives, and that kind of. So I said, we've got to do that. And then, so I created the, you know, the story of Ben Cartwright leaving the East Coast when his first wife died in childbirth, and moving west, and showing the problems, the difficulties that women had, leading to, in many cases, to their death, until finally he reaches, you know, the West and establishes the Ponderosa. Coming from the fact that we needed a strong father image, we had to do something about father being a fool. You know, where was that taking us in terms of national images for children to look at and watch?
And didn't the vice president of NBC call it a love affair between four men, Bonanza?
Yeah, right, because this was typical of NBC's, you know, lack of understanding, basically. You know, they were concerned with, as they, I guess, should be, with ratings and with costs and ratings, in that order. And the fact that this was not so much a love affair, though I don't object to that term, but there's a kind of a, what's the word, denigrative?
Almost a weakness about that.
Weakness,
yeah.
Which was not true. These were basically four very strong people. And what's wrong with strong people caring about each other, respecting one another? You know, my major in college was history, American history. And, you know, I pride myself on having a greater knowledge of American history than almost any producer in Hollywood, and even a great many of the writers. And I'm very meticulous about my use of history. I don't invent things. I know it too well, and I would be unhappy and uncomfortable with pure invention. So behind all my fiction, there's a basis in actual fact. The point about the Comstock load, not only is it based on actual history, but the previous history, the backstory of Bonanza, they came all the way west to the Valley of the Sacramento. Now, the Valley of the Sacramento was probably the most fertile piece of land in the entire West. We now call it the Central Valley of California. It's the largest, in terms of sheer volume and value, the largest agricultural area in the entire United States, the Central Valley of California. Michael Landon had been with me in the pilot Restless Gun and had done a few shows. Dan Block I brought along and gave more money. So there was the father and the oldest son, who was sort of the leading man image. We were at a Hollywood party, and in walked a man named Lon Green. And he's a very impressive figure, you know. And we talked about it, and my wife nudged me and says, "That's Ben Cartwright." I said, "Yeah, he's very interesting." So I go up to him, and I tell him that I'm writing a new show, not on the air yet, but I would like to consider him if he's willing for the part of the father of this family that I'm putting together. He says, well, he said, I know nothing about a Western. I said, well, this is a story about a family, and I think you probably would feel comfortable being a part of a family. He said, well, absolutely, you know. But I wanted to be sure, and he was doing a show. See, I was doing Restless Gun yet. I still remember I had 12 shows to do at Review Productions, the Old Republic Studio. And he was doing a show called Wagon Train, where the wagon master was an overbearing bully named Ward Bond, who intimidated everybody around him. So I went down, and they were staging a scene where this young actor from New York, a young named Lon Green, had a scene with Ward Bond. And he was toe-to-toe with him, and he couldn't, Lon was even more powerful and stronger, but in a more subtle way than Ward Bond. It was very obvious, you know. I said, wow, this guy is really good. Maybe he doesn't even know how good he is, you know. So we signed it. Then I had the job of the leading man, you know. And another actor on a different show there was Pernell Roberts, also from New York. And he had, you know, this wonderful black hair. I make a point about that. You know, and he's a handsome guy, and he had a kind of a brooding look about him, which looked very interesting, especially for younger ladies, I felt. And so I approached him, and he became Adam, you know. Oh, you remember I told you when I first went to the set and I saw him in this, he had this beautiful crop of black hair, and so I called him the next day and hired him. He had the, you know, the hair, and he looked. 2 days, the second day, he comes in and takes the piece off, and suddenly he's like 10, 15 years older. He said, I feel more natural playing this. I said, really? I said, when we talked about, and when I decided that and they said, yes, you will have the show, you had it on. As long as you do the show, you can have that on. And then many years later, when he did
Trapper John,
he took it off. And he was an old man by that time. I mean, he was older than he really was, you know. The problem was that NBC didn't want any of these 4 actors. They'd never heard of any of them. And then they threw the cost. I said, even though I was picking up the color difference, but they said it's still a location show. The whole thing is to be shot up in Lake Tahoe. It's still going to be the most expensive show we've ever done. So we needed at least an important actor to guarantee, you know, the insurance and thing. I said, no, these are hand-picked actors. No, we need at least one important star. I said, well, unless you can get me and pay for Marlon Brando, who was at the height of his career at that time, forget it. And they said, and you know, what were they going to do? I mean, I was crazy, and in fact, they told me that, but they allowed me, and I said one thing to them, which I just at the spur of the moment, I said, don't you understand? I said, television will make its own stars, will create its own stars. Huh, yeah. But of course, that was prophetic beyond any ability of mine to think that it might be. And so I wrote about all of them, actually, full stories about their background, because I wanted them to, you know, not be thin, tissue-thin characters. I want them to characters with some backgrounds and some characteristics which we could explore and grow on, develop, you know, as time went on. When we first went on the air, they put us on Saturday night, 7:30, against guess who? Perry Mason. There was this #1 show, CBS's big show. Because who would watch a show with 4 unknown actors? You see, they didn't, like they told me, we never heard of any of them, including Lon Green. I mean, none of it. And I told you that, I think I mentioned that television will make its own stars. So I said, these are people that I've hand-picked, you know. Well, but forget it, you know. But then I said, I won't do it unless you go with these people. And they said, all right. So we're against Perry Mason. Earlier, I had written a show called The Oxbow Incident, where Perry Mason played the lead. And he was marvelous in it. And we became pretty good friends. He would come to the house every once in a while and we'd talk. And so he called me when it was announced that we're up against me. He said, David, forget it. You know where you're going to beat us. I said, you're right, Ray. I mean, how can we? But that's where they put us. So it looked like he was right. The first year, I mean, hardly had made an impression. But people realized here was a chance to see a show in color. And all of a sudden, slowly a little bit, and then more quickly, and in greater volume, people started to buy color television sets. And shooting at the 7,000 foot above sea level at Tahoe, color responds, the fidelity of the film depends on how much exposure to true light. And we had the truest light in the world at that point, you know. So our color from the word go was absolutely brilliant. People would look at that and absolute amazement. This is what color is about? And dealers all through the country would say, oh, you want it? They'd have Bonanza. And people would just buy it, like, you know, like they were giving the sets away. And in Japan, with their sensitivity to color, you know, I often thought they thought Bonanza meant bonsai, you know, because they went absolutely wild about it. Anyway, so beginning near the end of the first year, we began to edge up a little bit on Perry Mason, just a little bit. But we renewed again Saturday night. And starting with the second year, more people became aware of the set, and more people became interested in his family. And I don't know, frankly, which was the greatest influence.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how much do you think color contributed to the show's success?
I think enormously in the beginning, enormously, because it was a new look, and no one had seen it before. And that, at least the curiosity seekers were very important. But if the show didn't hold their interest dramatically, you know, okay, so it's color, so so what, you know?
So the color was the bait, and then the characters, after they got hooked a little
I
bit,
think that's precisely the way it happened. Very good. The middle of the second year, lo and behold, we catch up to Perry Mason, and the end of the second year, not only do we beat him, but we knock him decisively out of first place. General Motors owns 9 o'clock on Sunday night, owns the hour, the flagship hour of television. They'd had Dinah Shore there for a number of years, and she was a wonderful entertainer, but she had sort of worn out her welcome. How many times could you come through the door wearing a different dress, you know? But she was a very fine lady, but General Motors said time, and they bought Bonanza and put it on Sunday night at 9 o'clock, and beginning of our third year. And that was the first year that we were number one. And of course, General Motors was thrilled. They came to me and said, David, how would you feel about doing commercials in color? I was doing commercials in color. I said, how would I feel about you doing commercials? Here I'm doing the first color television show, fighting everybody who says it's like too expensive, and I have black and white commercials. I mean, I would love it. So they did some wonderful, miraculous television specials. I mean, really outstanding with the color of the country, you know. And sales just boomerang because now women began to buy colors. Women didn't necessarily buy just the black. They bought the different colors, you know. And the sales just exploded. So at the end of that third year, I get a statement from NBC saying that because I agreed to pick up the color Dutchman, I owe them $2 million. Something has to be terribly wrong here. How could this be? So I called them and said I want to meet with them, and I point this out to them. I said, how is this possible? You know, well, that's the color instrument. I said, I mean, but this is being charged against me. Well, David, you were the one who agreed to pick this up. Do you want us to show you the contract you signed? I said, oh, wow. And because this is history, you know, it's so important. I said, well, then, if that's the way you feel, forget about it. I went back to the studio, which was Paramount, and I made one phone call to the man who was a man called Richard Eastland, who was the West Coast head of the Campbell and Ewald advertising agency, which General Motors used to buy their shows with. And told Dick about this thing and said, I'm just making this call to you because as soon as I hang up, I'm leaving, and get yourself another producer. He said, wait a minute. He said, don't leave yet. Give me an hour. He did. He called the senior executive vice president of General Motors in Detroit, a man I think Gail Sayers or something. And he called me. He said, "Is that true?" I said, "Yes." And I said, "As soon as we finish this conversation, I'm putting down the phone and leaving the studio." He says, "Don't leave yet." He called a man named Adams, who was the vice president of NBC, whose whole responsibility, his only responsibility, was the 9 o'clock hour on Sunday night with General Motors, which was a huge, huge sponsor, in those days. And then I get a call from the people here in Burbank saying they'd like to see me the next morning at Burbank. I said, well, I was about to leave. Don't come before you walk out. Come to see us. So I come to Burbank in the morning, and they show me the contract. I said, yes, I know, but this is what my reward for the #1 show, for bringing color television. I don't care whether you're one family or not, but RCA has made hundreds of millions of dollars on color sets now. I said, and I'm being penalized. I mean, it doesn't seem fair.
And they're marketing themselves as the Peacock Network.
Of course,
because
they
of
called
that.
it that. All of a sudden, it became all the colors. They said, well, this is what we're ready to do. We'll compromise with you. We'll split the difference. You mean I still owe you $1 million? Right. So what was I to do? Here, I had a show that's shooting. I have a writer come in that day, an hour later, for a story meeting. I'm editing 2 shows, one music editing, which had already been shot. So I say, okay. And it took me years, because payment in those days was microscopic compared to what it is today. It took me years to overcome that $1 million deficit. But finally, the show went on, and finally. So that is the story of how color came to television. I paid for it, essentially.